Hello, I'm Rob O'Donoghue from the Environmental Learning Research Centre at Rhodes University. And this presentation for a climate change education seminar on ethics at the University of Fort Hare was prepared out of work that I did with colleagues in the Handprint Care collaboration. And I've entitled it Handprints for Change, Clarifying the Cultural Foundations of an Ethic of Care for Deliberative Learning in Classroom Settings. And of course, the emphasis is here in Southern Africa and recovering the heritage foundation of an ethic of care. So what I do is I open with the Southern African context of high climate, seasonal variability around the El Nino Southern Oscillation, and look at climate and vegetation as a context for considering the cultural landscapes of Southern Africa. And here trying to clarify ethics-led action learning that disrupts the colonial nature-culture dialectic and recovers heritage for ethics-led learning as a more deliberative process around cultural landscapes and cultural processes. So some of the landscapes that we look at is Ukugelesha amongst the Xhosa, the Tonga cultural landscapes of fish harvesting, the agroecologies of early stone settlements, the Miombo woodland, and also the Hlabisa grasslands. And we build the entire process around heritage-activated learning task sequences using a 4-quadrant model after the work of Anne Edwards. And the question that I'm trying to address is, how is our Handprints for Change research informing heritage-activated and ethics-led learning in Southern African curriculum settings of ESD? Now, to do this, I mapped out some of the axes of tension within colonial modernity and some of the processes of change, like a move away from the emphasis on community to individual in education, the people-nature dialectic, and also the move from ethical processes to ethical principles that came with the colonial period. And trying to find some middle ground for education for sustainable development towards knowledge with a practical coherence that's relevant for the Southern African context and ethical solidarities that enable ESD work in these contexts for learning to transition to more just and sustainable futures together. So the question is, how can Indigenous ethical processes and heritage inform learning for sustainable futures using a handprint approach? And if we start off with this map of Southern Africa, a simplified vegetation map of interacting summer seasonal climatic processes, we have the ITCZ that moves as the sun brings the summer season to Southern Africa. We have the Southern Indian Ocean cyclonic system that is pulled into the subcontinent at times, the Southern Ocean frontal systems, and of course the cold current and upwelling on the west coast. So that's the sort of climatic context, and some recent data that I got from the CSIR Access program on climate extremes and seasonal variability is that the extreme states of the El Nino Southern Oscillation are now known to impact global weather. And here we've got the Enzo process of the El Nino, and you can see that dry and warm weather in Southern Africa. So the seasonal climate in Southern Africa responds to this signal with generally warmer and drier conditions associated with the El Nino state and cooler, wetter conditions in the La Nina state. So El Ninos have in the past been associated with record heat and droughts in the summer rainfall region, and La Ninas have been associated with flooding. Researchers have indicated that the regular monitoring of the El Niño Southern Oscillation suggests that a strong El Niño is currently developing in 2023. This comes on top of reports of unprecedented global sea surface temperatures and continuously rising average atmospheric temperatures. So should the El Niño manifest as projected, we should expect that this will have significant impact on the coming summer, climate and weather in Southern Africa. Now, if we look at this in a historiographic snapshot of ethics as a social process of moral orientation in a classroom setting, then Western ethics as character from the Greek ethos emerged and evolved within cultural processes of longue durée as embedded moral dispositions for guiding our actions. Over time, sociocultural processes of struggle shaped developing cultural solidarities in relation to what is right, good, and proper in diverse human intergenerational settings. These social processes and socialized dispositions develop within our life experience in the company of others for guiding our contact within developing social figurations. So if we look at this in Southern Africa from a Hunu Ubuntu process, we find that this resonates with this perspective on emergent ethics. And Hunu Ubuntu is defined as the process of mental, physical dispositions of an individual characterized by humility, kindness, courtesy, warmth, empathy, understanding, respectfulness, friendliness, responsibleness, and consideration with which manifests itself, amongst others, in the manner one talks, walks, behaves, dresses, and interacts with relatives and non-relatives alike. So this kind of ethical perspective and process plays out in the Southern African cultural settings. And if we now contrast this with what happened with the emergence of ethical codes using the work of Michael Foucault, he traces how ethics-orientated moralities in early Christian states in the West transitioned to code-orientated moralities in early nation states and modernity. So ethical codes of conduct were deployed in colonial education during the colonial period. They were implicit in modern education projects today, as these have developed out of the colonial period and have expanded within ESD as moral imperatives to educate for sustainability. This is currently a global moral imperative that developed around nature-cultural dialectic that can be traced back to the natural sciences and Western imperialism. Drawing on these positioning perspectives, I probe how the ethics education emanating from a colonial era excluded heritage practices and muted African processes of deliberative ethical solidarity for a common good. Now, if we take this into normative ethics in education, in his recent work on resonance-seeking imperatives within modernity, Rosa, in 2019, notes how within the sharing of stories, our mirror neurons and language establish the preconditions that allow the complex process of adopting other perspectives, thus engendering the intersubjective social phenomenon that is called narrative empathy. So this narrative empathy is a process, and in schooling, Noddings suggests that empathy is a spontaneous process and mediated narrative ethic of care for the other, and that it is both cognitive, in other words, it involves developing knowledge, and emotional, it involves the feeling and responses in social situations. Now, this enabled us to develop a handprint approach to ESD in Southern Africa, and this was clarified from an ethical standpoint as co-engaged ethical processes of deliberative meaning-making, Unu Ubuntu, towards knowledge-informed solidarities that enable shared action towards resolving concerns for a common good. And of course, it needs to be African. So drawing on John's work, looking at his recent PhD, he talks about love of Africa and love of being African. And here, a moral imperative of love and respect can be expanded to include the wider than human, within a shared duty to activate change for a common good. Now, to summarize this in an eloquent way, drawing on Smith, individual action is creative in the sense that when I enact care for the other, I strengthen the tissue of interpersonal solidarity in which ethical behavior resides. If interpersonal solidarity is rebuilt, it may enable and eventually make possible active citizenship within a reconstructed public sphere. So what this does now is it gives us a position for ethics in Africa and a position for ethics in handprint approaches to change. So now if we look at the landscapes of Southern Africa, and we've got centuries-old landscapes of change in Southern Africa, the diverse Southern African plateau and lowveld might best be described as heritage landscapes that emerged within and shaped the forests and savanna grasslands, which evolved with successive nomadic and migratory cultures over thousands of years. The earliest people were nomadic gatherer-hunters, many of whom followed the seasonal migrations of animals. Small stock and cattle people arrived in waves of southerly expansion that worked both ways, north and south, over hundreds of years. Cattle people also practiced shifting agriculture that opened up the woodlands, and they used fire to expand the grasslands for their herds. Chitumene agriculture today, for example, opened up forest areas in the past. This is still found in northern Zambia as a sustainable practice in cycles of 18 to 20 years because custom requires people to return to the lands of their birth to marry. So there's a long history of sustainable landscapes, and this happened through a process that in the indigenous language people talk about a process of taming the land, and Chigwedere explores this, in that landscape change was a slow process, and early migrations have been described in the folklore as a process of taming the land. Heritage practices of shifting agriculture and pasture management with fire, the grasslands provided more fodder for cattle and wild animals, as well as pushing out the habitats of the tsetse fly. That was a limitation. So if we try to model this, what we've got is the village and the processes of shaping the landscape around the village using the cattle and the arable lands to gather imifino, using fire, hunting and grazing. So this taming of the land processes can be looked at expanding agroecologies and the development of cultural landscapes. Today it's still possible to read these landscapes of Southern Africa as an outcome of the interactions of people and climate shaping Southern African landscapes. This developed over centuries of successive migrations, as we said earlier, where indigenous people created living landscapes in this area of high climate variability. Early cattle people, the Nguni, developed upland home ranges for cattle pastures that spilled over and expanded into lower areas where wildlife herds began to proliferate as human seasonal burning opened up woodland into the vast savanna grasslands of southern Africa, where people appeared to be surrounded by an Eden of wildlife to the colonial mindset or the colonial eye during the colonial process. And if we look at a decolonial reframing of the cultural concept of nature and culture as a dialectic, to uncover and recover ethical foundations for early indigenous land care practices, it's possible to see how the intertropical convergence zone, the southern Indian Ocean cyclones, and the frontal systems in an area of high climate variability, we had people shaping landscapes and creating cultures that enable them to live successfully in these areas through these processes of taming the land. And if we look at some examples in this presentation, I'll look at the Nyanga area, look at the Bokoni, or the area of the Miombo, the Zululand grasslands, and the Xhosa grasslands of southern Africa. And here what we've got is similar processes, different landscapes, and developing, shaping processes that produced these agroecological cultural landscapes that are around us today and at risk through the modern era of post-colonial struggle. If we jump straight into looking at climate-smart agriculture in a Southern African context, you've got it as an ancient creation, this landscape of indigenous peoples within the climate extremes as sustainable agroecologies that lasted for hundreds of years. The region is a region of climate extremes, and the El Nino Southern Oscillation is an episodic creator of droughts. And people adapted to this, and they were able to create and adapt their landscapes to survive over many hundreds of years. And the earliest agroecologies that we've now got evidence from the anthropologists and archaeologists is the Nyanga and the Bokoni in southern Africa. And this can be traced wider in the upland areas of central and southern Africa. So if we look at cultural adaptation to these climate extremes, you've got particular times of the year when particular patterns of ukugelesha in the case of the Xhosa, and you'd get the droughts that would lead to seasonal migrations to the Zuurveld. And of course, a key thing was maintaining living waters. So there's a rich cultural fabric here of centuries of adapting landscapes for human success and human beings working within these landscapes. So a key question that came up for us is, how do we plan together for high climate variability in the future? Does this knowledge of the past enable us to begin to look at the cultural landscapes of the Eastern Cape, here of the Xhosa, and be able to say something about these landscapes that the colonials thought were natural, and they contrasted them with culture, and then culture became the problem of destroying the natural landscapes. We need to reread these landscapes as cultural landscapes, where there has been a land taming, and where you get the grassland savanna and the high forests and the coastal forests having been adapted over centuries to produce this cultural landscape. And what we're going to do is look at rainfall harvesting, or ukugelesha, as an example of this process of cultural adaptation in this landscape. And we tune in with a story about ukugelesha. For centuries, the Xhosa experienced cycles of drought. As cattle people, they harvested imifino and grew vegetables in their household gardens. Each winter season, as Orion's belt became visible in the night sky, they would put cattle into the fields to fertilize these before breaking ground in preparation for the spring rains, so that the seasonal climate variation did not enable them to predict the spring rains each year. Ukugelesha allowed them to capture winter rainfall to aid ploughing and to enable crop germination. So we could take up this as a climate change and soil moisture challenge informed by the Xhosa practice and say, well, where do our vegetables come from today? From the supermarket? Do we harvest water into the soil in the same way as the Xhosa used to? Should we use hose pipes? Can we put in rainwater tanks? What can we try out together? Should we be watering with hose pipes, or should we be watering with water cans? And how do we prepare for drought conditions? So it's possible to bring heritage in, and also this seasonal ethic of land care, into our classroom settings. Let's now move to the Tsonga cultural landscapes of Maputoland. And here, again, you've got a cultural landscape that was created from upland forest and coastal forest, and you've got the fishing culture and harvesting and gardening culture of the Tsonga. And on the website, there is a startup story that relates to the Sustainable Development Goals and the conservation of biodiversity. Off to in Nyanga now, and one of the earliest stone cultures. It's very similar to the Bokoni in the Mpumalanga area of South Africa. And here again, upland forest and savanna and grasslands being combined, and cultural adaptation of producing these terraces. And we can explore how did these terraces aid them, like the Uhugalesha, to capture water and to begin to move from sorghum into the growing of maize, which is very evident amongst the Bokoni in South Africa. Next to the Makuvisi landscape of the Meomba woodland, and immediately you say, well, this remains woodland with the grasses underneath. And the woodland savanna was adapted by the Shona people, who have dark cattle that stayed in the sheltered area during the summer, and then during the winter they were able to be moved out. And this work was done with the late Tich Pesanai, and is a fascinating example of Southern African cultural landscapes and adaptation to seasonal climate. Now to the Nguni upland cultural climate of the Zulu. This I found as a free picture on the internet, and it really reflects the dynamics of this grassland, like in Hlubisa, looking down on Hluhluwe, which of course is now forests, but it was a cultural landscape of grassland that was developed from the forests, both the coastal forests, through the land taming of this area on a massive scale, and very successful and highly sustainable. So this is explored drawing on Magema Fuze's early writings, and also on the problem of cholera, which is now back with us today in South Africa as a challenge for us to look after our water resources better. So a lot of this work was developed through the handprint collaboration with Germany, Mexico, India, and including work in Japan, Norway, Malaysia, and mostly with exceptional indigenous scholars who have worked with and edited and revised this work over periods. Many of them have undertaken PhDs, and others have taken it up just as a passion for love of Africa and wanting to see their country in the curriculum as teachers. So the exemplars provide starting points for lesson planning in curriculum settings, and little more than this. Heritage narratives cannot reflect the nuance and diversity that comes with situated IK work in mother tongue. So narratives should be read as seeds for working towards more inclusive learning mediated by those engaged with and with memory of sustainable heritage practices for informing deliberative learning towards more just and sustainable futures. And teachers describe how they have an idea and they find someone locally, and we drew on a lot of this, the work that teachers have reported to us on heritage-activated ethics in their classroom settings. And we've developed this around the four-quadrant framework that is easy to work with because it starts with authentic, local story sharing, often in mother tongue, and then taking this into a process of finding out and working out possible solutions to a common problem, and then taking action on a small scale through a change project. But understanding the ethics is an important part of this. And our ethical patterns of knowing, feeling, and doing emerge around cognizant dispositions. In other words, dispositions of knowing and volitional agency, choosing to do things the handprint way. This was very evident in the work that young people in India took up, and similarly here in South Africa. So Noddings notes from a theoretical point of view that empathy, feeling for others, as an ethic of care, is both cognitive, in other words, it involves knowledge, and it involves emotions and feelings. And it's mediated in teaching and learning settings in diverse ways. So we can start off with modeling, and modeling comes with quadrant 1 and a story, the story sharing of the students. And then we move into dialogue, discussion straight away, into picking this up and trying to find out more and work out solutions. And then finding out and working out can lead to trying out in practice. And then finally, throughout this process, confirmation or affirmation. So across the way that we work with students in deliberative ways in our classroom settings, we start seeing the ethical foundations for love of land, for care for each other, and care for surroundings. And it's possible then to carry this into an Afrophilic, a love-based model of dialogue and practice in our classroom settings as we're learning things, feeling things, and working things out together with affirming actions within caring relations, as Noddings points out. So in other words, the ethical work in the classroom comes out of the way we model out of African heritage, the way we model things in the present, right through to the way that we build caring relations that expand into caring for more than just each other, and into the land, and also wider caring for other species. Now, if we try to put this into a pedagogy for heritage-activated learning towards more just and sustainable futures, we can't just start in the present and look at a contradiction or a problem and then jump this into the future. This has been the pattern in Southern Africa because there's been an exclusion of heritage. There's been an exclusion of the past, and heritage practices, life experiences, and ethical questions are not very commonly found in curriculum settings. And if we look at understanding how the past has produced the matters of concern in the present, then we're able to understand the contradictions. And this came out of the work of Chikamori and Schudel. And it's possible now to say, well, in the present, if the first stimulation in our learning transactions is emerging contradictions and problems and challenges that we now start to see how these were produced, then what we're able to do is to bring in the second stimulation of the heritage practices, our life experience, and these are mediating tools for knowledge-based ethical thinking, ascending from the abstract, in other words, the idea and the language, the concepts, to the concrete, to doing something in practice. And this can allow us to begin on a handprint learning journey on pathways to ethics-led volitional actions with the agency to do something about the challenges that face humanity today. Now, if we take our four-quadrant framework, it becomes a very useful and practical tool for starting with real-world heritage and life experience so that we are able to pick up into the present and understanding so that the students start formative inquiry. They start looking at how things came to be, the problems, and what can we learn from the concepts in the curriculum and the heritage that we bring into this learning. Then we're able to take this into change projects. So it's a very simple model of working out of the past into the present together with ethics-led concerns and looking at what can we do in terms of building positive futures. So the entire presentation is based on this idea of we need to give more attention to African heritage. We need to give more attention to African processes of ethical deliberation. And the classroom needs to become a place where we can learn and share and produce new knowledge that we can take into the futures in positive ways that will allow us to transition to more ethics-led, knowledge-informed ways of being and doing things together in a changing world.